August 14th, 2005. A perfectly normal Sunday morning. Families heading on vacation, business travelers returning home, children pressed against airplane windows, excited about the journey ahead. Nobody on board Helios 522 had any idea that within the next few hours, every single one of them would be dead. Not because of a terrorist attack, not because of a catastrophic mechanical failure, not because of a freak storm, but because of one tiny switch left in the wrong position by mistake. This is the story of how a series of small, almost invisible errors cascaded into one of the most haunting aviation disasters ever recorded. A ghost plane, 121 souls, and a mystery that unfolded live in the skies above Athens. At 6:07 in the morning, Helios 522 lifts off from Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. It's carrying 115 passengers, 4 cabin crew members, and 2 highly experienced pilots. The destination is Athens, Greece, roughly an hour and a half away. A routine short-haul flight, the kind that happens hundreds of times a day across Europe without anyone even thinking twice. The captain is 58-year-old Hans-Jürgen Merten, a veteran of the skies with 35 years of experience and over 16,900 flight hours to his name. Sitting beside him is First Officer Pampos Charalambos, 51 years old, 17 years of experience, 7,500 flight hours. Together, these 2 men represent decades of combined aviation expertise. And yet, what happens next will leave investigators, aviation experts, and the entire world stunned. 25 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft reaches its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet and settles onto its planned route. Everything from the outside appears completely normal. But inside that aircraft, something is already going terribly wrong. A silent killer is already at work. To understand what is happening inside that plane, we need to step back and understand one of the most critical and most invisible systems in modern aviation: cabin pressurization. Think about this. Commercial aircraft cruise at altitudes between 33,000 and 40,000 feet. For context, Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth, sits at just under 29,000 feet. Mountaineers attempting to summit Everest require supplemental oxygen just to stay alive up there. The air at that altitude is so thin, so oxygen-deprived, that the human body simply cannot function without help. Now, consider that your typical passenger jet flies nearly 1.5 miles higher than the top of Everest. Without some form of intervention, every person on board would be unconscious within minutes and dead shortly after. The reason this doesn't happen is because of a system called cabin pressurization. The aircraft's engines continuously compress outside air and pump it into the cabin, maintaining an internal air pressure roughly equivalent to what you'd experience at 6,000 to 8,000 feet above sea level. A small component called the outflow valve automatically regulates this pressure, opening to release excess pressure, closing to retain it, keeping the environment inside the plane safe and breathable for everyone on board. It is one of the most vital systems on any commercial aircraft, and it has to work automatically, because if it doesn't, there is no alarm, no warning sign, no dramatic event to alert you. There is simply silence, and then unconsciousness, and then death. The condition is called hypoxia, oxygen deprivation. And what makes hypoxia so terrifying is that it doesn't feel like dying. It feels like drowning in a warm, comfortable fog. Your thoughts slow down. You feel strangely calm. You might even feel euphoric. You don't realize you're losing consciousness. You don't realize you're dying. You just fade. Now, let's go back 8 hours before the crash. At 1:25 in the morning, Helios 522 lands in Cyprus after flying in from London. The incoming crew notices an issue. The right service door seal is freezing and making noise during flight. This needs to be checked. A 44-year-old ground engineer named Alan Irwin is tasked with the inspection.
Alan performs a visual check of the door. He also runs a cabin pressurization leak test to confirm no air is escaping through the seal. Here's the thing. The aircraft's engines are off at this point, so to pressurize the plane for the test, Alan uses the Auxiliary Power Unit, or APU, a small onboard generator that provides power when the main engines aren't running. And here's where it begins. To perform the test, Alan must switch the pressurization system from its normal automatic mode to manual mode. He conducts the test. He finds no issues with the door. He clears the aircraft for its next flight, and then he walks away, leaving the pressurization system in manual mode. It was a mistake, a simple, human, forgettable mistake, one that every single subsequent checkpoint was supposed to catch and correct. None of them did. At around 5 in the morning, the crew of Helios 522 arrives for their pre-flight meeting. Captain Merton and First Officer Charalambous board the aircraft and begin their pre-flight procedures, a carefully designed series of checks that pilots must complete before every single flight. One of the specific duties of the first officer during this procedure is to verify that the pressurization mode is set to automatic. He checks it. He moves on. The switch stays in manual. Then comes the pre-flight checklist, a methodical, item-by-item review of all critical systems. The pressurization system is on that checklist. Both pilots go through it together. The switch stays in manual. The plane takes off at 6:07 a.m. After takeoff, there is yet another checklist, the after-takeoff checklist. The very first item on this checklist is the pressurization system. The switch stays in manual. 3 separate opportunities, 3 experienced aviation professionals, 0 corrections. How is this possible? The investigators who later examined this accident identified something called expectation bias, a well-documented psychological phenomenon where our brains essentially see what they expect to see rather than what is actually there. The pressurization switch had always been in automatic mode during every previous flight these pilots had ever operated. Their minds were so strongly conditioned to that reality that even when they looked directly at the switch in manual mode, their brains registered it as normal. The green indicator light didn't help. Green is typically associated with all clear, with normal, with everything is fine. Had the light been red to indicate manual mode, the outcome might have been entirely different. Investigators also found that the checklist design itself was flawed. The pressurization setting was grouped alongside numerous other settings, making it easy to overlook one item while verifying several others. And records from the first officer's training revealed a troubling pattern. He had a documented history of not following standard operating procedures properly, making checklist errors, and losing composure in non-normal situations. But none of these factors, not the expectation bias, not the indicator light design, not the flawed checklist, not the first officer's training record, would have mattered if only one of the 3 checks had caught the error. That's what makes this accident so deeply unsettling. It wasn't one failure. It was a perfect, terrible alignment of multiple small failures stacked on top of each other like dominoes. 5 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft climbs through 12,000 feet, and that's when a warning sound begins blaring in the cockpit. Both pilots are immediately confused. The sound they're hearing is the takeoff configuration warning, an alarm that's designed to alert pilots when the aircraft is not properly configured for takeoff while it's still on the ground. But they're already airborne. Why would they be getting a takeoff configuration warning now? What they don't know, what they cannot know, because nothing clearly told them, is that it isn't a takeoff configuration warning at all. It's the cabin altitude warning. Because the pressurization system is in manual mode and not actively maintaining cabin pressure, the air inside the plane is getting thinner and thinner as the aircraft climbs higher. The cabin altitude warning triggers when the internal air pressure drops to a dangerous level.
Here's the cruel twist of fate. The takeoff configuration warning and the cabin altitude warning on this aircraft produced nearly identical sounds. The pilots had no reason to suspect it was anything other than a ground configuration error. The captain contacts the ground engineer to discuss what he believes is a configuration problem. As they're talking, the plane continues climbing on autopilot. By the time the aircraft passes through 14,000 feet, the cabin air pressure has dropped low enough to automatically deploy the passenger oxygen masks. The masks dropped from the overhead compartments throughout the cabin. Passengers, already confused and beginning to feel the effects of hypoxia, reach for them. An indicator light in the cockpit confirms that the masks have deployed. But at the exact same moment, another warning activates, the equipment cooling warning. The aircraft's electronic cooling systems have stopped working properly because there isn't enough air to push air through the cooling vents. So now the pilots have two simultaneous warnings, and tragically, they focus on the one that makes sense to them in the context of what they believe is happening, an equipment malfunction. They dismiss the oxygen mask deployment indicator. Had they paused, had they looked at that indicator and recognized what it meant, cabin depressurization, protocol would have required them to immediately don their own oxygen masks, declare an emergency, and execute an emergency descent to a lower altitude where they could breathe safely. They never do any of that. The captain, increasingly confused by what he believes is an electrical problem, asks the ground engineer over the radio about the location of the circuit breakers on the aircraft. He thinks the equipment is overheating due to excess electrical current. The ground engineer tells him the breakers are located behind the captain's seat. The captain gets up from his seat to investigate. Moments later, he collapses from hypoxia. The first officer, already deeply impaired by oxygen deprivation, slumps forward in his seat, unconscious. The last contact with the flight crew is lost. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers' emergency oxygen supply, the masks that dropped automatically, lasted only about 12 minutes. Designed to give the crew time to descend to a safe altitude, these masks were never meant to be a long-term solution. One by one, the supply runs out. One by one, the passengers lose consciousness. The plane, still set on autopilot, continues its programmed flight path. It climbs to 34,000 feet, levels off, and flies on towards Athens as if nothing is wrong, as if 121 people are dying inside it.
At 7:37 a.m., 1 hour and 30 minutes after takeoff, Helios 522 arrives in the airspace above Athens International Airport. The autopilot, faithfully executing its instructions, enters the aircraft into a holding pattern, the standard oval circuit that planes fly while waiting for landing clearance from air traffic control. Athens ATC tries to reach the flight. No response. They try again and again. 15 minutes pass. The plane just keeps circling, silent, unresponsive, an eerie, orbiting ghost. An alert is issued. 2 F-16 fighter jets of the Hellenic Air Force are scrambled and directed to intercept. The pilots of the F-16s pull alongside Helios 522 and begin their visual inspection. What they report back to the ground stops everyone cold. The aircraft shows no external damage, but the captain's seat is empty. The first officer is slumped forward in his seat, motionless, apparently unconscious. No passengers are reacting to the presence of military fighter jets flying just meters away from their windows. Many are visible with oxygen masks on their faces, but they are not moving. The aircraft is full of people, and yet it is utterly, completely silent. It is, for all purposes, a flying coffin. And then something extraordinary happens. One of the F-16 pilots watches as a figure appears in the cockpit doorway and moves toward the captain's vacant seat. The person sits down, puts on the headphones, and appears to attempt to work the controls. The F-16 pilot uses hand gestures to direct him to land the aircraft. The man in the captain's seat responds, pointing downward with his hand. Moments later, Helios 522 begins to descend. That person was Andreas Prodromou, a 26-year-old flight attendant on board the aircraft. While every other person on the plane had succumbed to hypoxia, Andreas had managed to remain conscious by using the portable emergency oxygen bottles available on the aircraft for the cabin crew. Moving through a plane full of unconscious or dying people, he made his way to the cockpit. Andreas held a commercial pilot's license issued in the United Kingdom, but he was not certified to fly a Boeing 737. He had never trained on this specific aircraft. Nevertheless, he sat down and tried. The engines flamed out as the aircraft exhausted its fuel supply. Without power, there was nothing he could do to make a controlled landing. What Andreas did do, and what investigators later credited him for, was guide the stricken aircraft away from the densely populated urban areas of Athens, steering it toward a more remote, mountainous terrain. At 12:03 p.m., Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed into a hillside near the town of Grammatico, approximately 40 kilometers north of Athens. All 121 people on board were killed. It became, and remains, the deadliest aviation accident in Greek history. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough in European aviation history, and what it revealed wasn't just the story of a single flight, or a single switch, or a single mistake. It was a story about the systemic vulnerabilities that exist in aviation and in human decision-making itself. The ground engineer who left the pressurization switch in manual mode was found to have violated standard procedures, but the investigation emphasized that his error alone did not cause the crash. It was the failure of every subsequent safety layer, the first officer's pre-flight check, the joint checklist review, the after-takeoff checklist, that allowed that single mistake to survive all the way to 34,000 feet. The investigation revealed the dangers of identical alarm sounds for different warning types. It exposed the psychological power of expectation bias and how even the most experienced professionals can be fooled by their own mental patterns. It identified design flaws in checklists that grouped too many items together, making individual items easy to overlook. In response to the findings, sweeping changes were made across the aviation industry. Pilot training was revised with a specific focus on hypoxia recognition and emergency depressurization procedures. Warning systems were redesigned so that critical alarms could not be confused with one another. Checklists were restructured and simplified. The pressurization system interface itself was modified so that manual mode would trigger an unmistakably visible warning. The 121 people who died at Helios 522 did not die because someone wanted to hurt them. They died because of a cascade of small human errors, compounded by design flaws, compounded by psychological biases, and compounded by the terrible randomness of timing and coincidence. Their deaths changed aviation for the better. Thousands of lives have likely been saved because of the lessons drawn from this tragedy. That is not a comfortable thought. It is simply the truth. The image that stays with you, the image that stayed with the F-16 pilots who flew alongside that plane, and that has stayed with everyone who has studied this case, is of a fully intact aircraft, engines running, autopilot engaged, circling peacefully above the blue Aegean sky. From the outside, nothing appeared wrong. It looked like any other plane on any other morning. But inside, 121 people were already gone. One switch, left in the wrong position, for just a few hours. That's all it took.